She is an explorer of borders of landscape and borders of our imagination and ideas on what a landscape can be and what it can imply. She has done a lot of investigative work and mapping, not least water and how it flows and what kind of entrance points that infrastructure, the floating infrastructure, can have for the creation of society. Anuradha Mathur, welcome to the stage. It's all yours.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back in Sweden, and though I've never been to Stockholm, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Now, as was made very, I guess, eloquently evident in this, in the conversations we had this morning, is that as landscape architects, we are getting drawn more and more, and we are pushed to be inclusive in how we work, and not only in our designs, but even in the process of our projects. To be inclusive of not only different people, different ethnicities, but of, ages, plants, animals, ecologies, environments. So this is very much part of the milieu we are all practicing in today. And we see ourselves as actually stewards of that kind of inclusiveness, versus other fields of design. We feel that landscape architects have that sensibility. But what I would really like to talk about today is what we exclude. And I'd like to talk about what we exclude, not so much in the projects we get, but already in the eye by which we see places. There's an exclusion that is built in the way we have visualized, the way we actually imagine places. And in particular, I want to actually touch on the line. And it's a very particular line I want to talk about. And as our moderator mentioned, borders. I would call it a line, actually, that divides land and water. And it's a line which is a designed line. It's not a natural line. It's a line that we've inherited, whether it's land and water, city and river, ocean and, settlement. It has a profound impact already in what we do thereafter. And I will do so by invoking a particular landscape, and you see the word there called Maidan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this word, but it is a word of Persian origin. And for many of you who've traveled around, it is used to commonly describe places in South Asia or maybe the Middle East. It's seen for places which are commonly seen as being accommodating, rallies and sports and many, many, many kinds of uses, right down to, grazing of goats. But that's actually seeing Maidan as a kind of space in the city. And so very often it's translated as a square or as a large park, but we're seeing it within a realm. It's also been recently, I don't know if you've sort of picked on it, that's been invoked in the Ukraine when they described this one place in Kiev, or the movement itself being a Euromaidan. And so there's something in that word which actually is beyond actually a space that's described. And I think I want to invoke that ground. And I think it's a ground that actually lies beneath many of these typologies that we inherit as landscape architects. And for me, I'd like to do that through actually three kinds of spaces or three kinds of grounds that I've experienced in India or South Asia. And they also tend to be grounds which come out of a monsoon landscape. And they sort of challenge some of this visualization of these divides I just sort of spoke about. And so I want to, sort of talk about places where you get a glimpse of the Maidan and what I'm calling beyond riverfronts, beyond seafronts, and beyond lakefronts. And the beyond is important because I don't know what else to call this territory. And Maidan is sort of a word I'm using generally to sort of talk about this quality. And why it's important to talk about it is that it's getting more and more scarce. It's getting buried. And I think it's always present, but we are in the assumptions we are making about what is landscape, what is design, maybe some of the generic ideas about landscape, about things which are moving because of global economies. The Maidan is actually being more and more lost. Many of you may, have probably experienced that rivers in India are very often seasonal. So what you see many times when you travel is just this plain. It's a plain. And there is a time, maybe 3 months in a year, a few, months, what it might be like, what you're seeing the other side, when it's full of water. And so this fluctuation, this sort of temporary aspect of landscape is really important. When the monsoons come, it fills up. And when it fills up, that water could be used for things. It's used for agriculture, it's used in the city. Today, of course, the sewers are emptying into this water, so it gets contaminated. But I do remember a time when, this plain was very much, whether there were goats grazing on it, whether there were vegetable markets on it, agriculture happening, grass would grow, even some very important fairs, like an image in the middle over there, which is of a Gujari fair, which has been around for at least 100 years, which would actually come and, be part of this, this plain, which I would like to think of as a Maidan. Today, of course, the city of Ahmedabad, where what you're looking at is the Sabarmati River. Actually, before I get to it, is that partly because it's Ahmedabad, this particular image, and I'm going to go back to one other, which is really important, I missed telling you about. These images actually in the middle over here are from a famous photographer, French photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson, who took them, I guess in the 50s. And they are actually dyers and, other sort of people working on the Sabarmati bed. So one never even thought about it as a river with water, which is blue and, that is brown. And this particular image, which I will expand over here, was actually the beginning of the Salt March by Gandhi. And this is where they actually gathered on the Sabarmati. It's interesting to note that Gandhi was actually not allowed to assemble in public places. And so they chose the Sabarmati River bed, or this plain, as the ground of their gathering. So in some ways, it was seen as outside of the typologies of what we think of public places. Now, what's happened today, or has been happening for a while, is that people don't want to see this plain anymore. We want a riverfront. And so there is a massive project underway where we're actually narrowing down the Sabarmati. It's a lot of land being created for real estate, and we want to see water all the time. So there is meant to be perennial water. Now, it's the prized project of the city of Ahmedabad. It's a project which the Prime Minister has sort of made his, very public and is very proud of. It's interesting to note that if you want a riverfront, then you must have water as well. I mean, so you need water. And when you look at what is really going on in this place is that, this is Ahmedabad and this is the Sabarmati that you saw. This is the Narmada River, and if anybody's followed the politics of dam building, this particular Narmada was very, very well known and changed many policies in the world. So one of the many controversial dams over here, actually there's a canal, and these are images of the canal moving, siphons the water and brings it to Ahmedabad, and it crosses many dry river plains. And only when it reaches Ahmedabad, it actually empties in. So that's actually power. Like, it brings it into this thing. And you have a waterfront today. Now, for me at least, I'm not so concerned about where the water is coming from, but the phenomena that in order to actually have a riverfront, you need to actually construct this massive infrastructure. Now, it's important because that project is important because it's not a one-off project where, there was power. This is being replicated across the country. And just north of Ahmedabad, this is the city of Ahmedabad, and the project which I showed you has already been built in this part. There is another little territory here called Gift City, which is there was a competition, a landscape competition for it. And when you look at the site, and I won't dwell too much on it, you realize that even though the competition talked about environmental values, inclusion, ecology, everything, you could have the right words, they already erased everything of that landscape before the project or the landscape competition even began. All the waterways, everything was leveled, and, and the image is this blue where we can have, riverfront, which is like a lake, and a lakefront. And that's what we are aspiring towards. So this separation of fronting water and constructing a kind of exclusion or a confrontation is something that is really important to think about, especially in a monsoon landscape where there isn't water all the time or not all the time. And so for me and for a lot of the projects that we have been interested in, this is something we carry with us. We carry with us, what does it mean today? It's not, and I'm not that concerned whether the formal language of this project, whether it's concrete or it's green or this is all glass and it could be a different architecture. It's the fundamental sort of way of looking at this infrastructure or this ground that is actually up for question. And I couldn't help inserting 2 slides from a visit I had done to the desert landscape of Rajasthan, just a few months ago. What you're looking at here is not just a sandy part of the desert. That's actually the bed of a luni, which is also seen as a river. But this is a famous fair that has been happening for another 100 years, where it's not only people, and we were there at the tail end of the fair, but from camels to cattle to goats to everybody is part of the fair. So it's really that water is one occupant in this landscape. And there are all these trajectories. So it's an open landscape where things intersect, they move, and they come together. And at some point, it looks like a river because water arrives there and then it moves away. And so that sensibility opens up a very different way of thinking about inclusion, rather than already beginning with this divide of what we as landscape architects inherit as waterfront projects, which are happening the world over. And of course, these are images of dyers and other sort of crafts which are happening right on that at other times when the fair is not over there. But I want to sort of move you from this area now. What you looked at was a desert, but that is a monsoon landscape too, because the rain comes, it may be a few inches in a year, but the whole landscape has been sort of tuned, and the way people live has still been tuned to that. And that was an image in the present. And one could almost say that, that sense of the Maidan is sort of applicable over there because it's so remote, it's so sort of rural. But I want to bring you right in the middle of Mumbai, actually a city of 20 million people, and sort of talk about how the significance of the Maidan can be actually seen right in the middle of a place where there's so many people who live there. And how do we actually recover this sensibility? What you're looking at on your left is an image of, I would say it's actually almost a sewage drain. It's called the Methi River, and people are trying to recover it as a Methi riverfront project. It's goes under the international airport, and this is just a detail of it. What's interesting is that there was a major flood in 2005 when, I think the same time when there was Katrina in New Orleans, and Mumbai was flooding. And it was decided that it was this little drain or river in this landscape that was the culprit. And so the whole idea is that how do we manage it? So at one hand, as designers, we inherit this sort of riverfront recreational beautification project. On the other hand, there is the sort of the flood control and the containing of the drain. And so this is a model, very much like the Army Corps. We have our own Army Corps over there, which that's the image by which they're trying to manage it. And so you draw very, very thick, clear blue lines and decide that this is the space of water and that's the space of land. And so with this image, what really happens is that, when you have landscapes like this, which is not only in Mumbai, but it's, across the world, when water crosses that line we have drawn, we call it flood. Now, in some ways, if you just look at that, I mean, is flood a natural condition, or is flood actually a human-made sort of, presence? Because we've drawn the line and water crosses it. And however wide you draw the line, once you draw the line, we've actually constructed flood. But, of course, the knee-jerk reaction is to, okay, we have to manage it. We have to see how much area can we get. This is a very dense area. There's an airport. There are millions informal, settlements and people who live here. So all we can do is try and contain it. So there is a sense that there's very little space in Bombay. So even though we know we need a wider floodplain, we need many other things, even in order to make a riverfront, and there are projects for jogging paths up and down this, even though I didn't know people in Bombay really jogged that much, but that's sort of the vocabulary we have been using. The question is, how do you actually look at this landscape where it's not a few inches of rain, but there are, at least in that 2005 when there was this massive flood, there were what would be 90 mm, that's about 3 meters of rain in 2 days. That's a heck of a lot of water. So, monsoon landscape fluctuate between that kind of extreme. And, but if you start thinking that monsoons, when they're coming down here, they are really a landscape of holding, that you, rather than letting water drain off the land, you actually have to hold it, you have to delay it. And so for us, actually, rather than thinking of this line as the territory we had to work in, we felt that all the territories around, and by around, I'm not sort of drawing a wider floodplain, I'm actually looking at all these trajectories. The airport is a trajectory, there are informal settlements, there are formal settlements, there are drains coming in. All this landscape is really part of this plane, which we are actually looking at. And so how do we actually start to find another way of thinking about it? And one of the most important realizations for us was that rather than looking at the river as the place of water and as we have to design outside of it, we said that in some ways the Methi itself is the Maidan. Can it be the place where At some point, the monsoon comes and it carries, it carries the monsoon water, but other times where it's sewage, it actually could become a place where you clean the water, you sort of cleanse it. And, there were many people this morning who talked about the need to think about rain and, all our sort of what we sort of give out of the city. And anybody who's traveled to India would realize that this, places like this are just cesspools of sewage. And so for us, it was less about looking at borders, but actually looking at it, as inclusive. And so for us, it was very important to draw out that there's not only one actor. It's not river against the city. It's not river as a recreation. But all these people have to play into this landscape. And so working sectionally became a very important sort of a way of working, because we felt that when we look at things in plan, it's very natural even for me to say, okay, that's land, what I can get and what I cannot. So there is a certain delay of doing what you saw earlier was these photo walks in which we actually walked the landscape and built certain adjacencies. So, distances were not absolute. Certain things are closer because they have a relationship. Certain things which may be right next to the airport but are not next to it because they're disconnected were further. But working in section, we realized that actually this actually is a gathering of this larger landscape. It's not really about looking at this particular two lines held, within a certain space. And, thinking of infrastructures. But what's important is sort of the notation at the bottom, which I'll just isolate, because for us, that was the mithi. That was the place where everything was happening. So if you look at it, we were starting to think that if you think of Bombay in terms of time, there's actually a lot of space. So, there's a wall which goes around the airport today. It's just a wall that people keep breaching, but that becomes a holder of water. The mithi itself has plants which clean it biotically. It becomes a place of cleaning. At the time of the monsoon, it becomes a place of holding. And so it becomes the arena rather than it become the space on the edges of which we do things. And there is also a sense that, these landscapes accumulate in time and through multiplicity. So inclusion also starts to open up an idea that, you do not actually look at it in the bird's eye view and try to figure out everything that's happening at one time, that how do you set certain things in place that allow things to actually evolve. And so from many of the good things we today look in the West, from urban agriculture to cleaning water to, doing all these things have been completely erased out of these landscapes today, because we have a different idea of development in India, that, that image you saw of Gift City, that's what we want. And how do we start to bring practices in rather than those images back in, was one of the things that we were really quite, keen on. Now, what's really interesting in a place like Mumbai, and I'm going to take you back, but I'm going to take you back into Mumbai, but through the sea. Now, when you think about a harbor and a beach, I wonder what that sort of brings up in your mind. One, of course, is that, harbors have ships and beaches have boats, and there's something very interesting and peculiar about the way boats are designed in this landscape and the way ships were done, which were already drawn, planned, and then built, while boats were built and then they were measure drawn later by the British. But that's another whole story. But what's really interesting about beaches and harbors in this landscape is that harbors are exclusionary landscapes. I mean, they are isolated. They tend to reinforce the lines because harbors need clean edges where ships dock. While beaches have always been this ambiguous place, I mean, and if you had to look at really negatively, that's where all the smugglers come in. Even the big terrorist attack in Bombay, they actually came through the beach. So it's always been that place on the edge where it has a different sense of inclusion, but also informality. And as we know, as many of you here are all landscape architects, that beaches are one of the most dynamic landscapes. That it's very difficult to sort of hold and say where a beach stops or to draw a line through it. So you'll find many maps, actually, especially older ones, which would actually draw beaches at dotted lines because you couldn't quite fix where that line was. But with harbors, we are very clear. We know where we want to actually draw that line. And that sort of, if I just go back a little bit in time and with thinking that how did this line harden actually has been a very sort of a question that has been sort of troubling us. And you look at some of these old Portolan charts, which I'm sure you're familiar with, even within that hard line, there's a real porosity that you feel that there is sort of a give and take between what is land and what is water. And some of these later maps, which were done by sailors, it keeps getting harder and harder and harder. And even today, if you walk and you actually travel through these places, that's the kind of landscapes you see. And you wonder, that it actually took an act of design or real imagination to draw a line through these landscapes, the mangroves, salt pans, beaches. It's not easy to see a line. I mean, a surveyor had to actually, just say, okay, I'm just going to put it over there. And once that line is there, it becomes the reality. And so historically, even maps like this, I mean, this is a map from 1897 of Mumbai. And you realize that it's a very beautiful map with a lot of detail in terms of the land, and all the kind of features which, if you could zoom into it. But you realize that it starts to clarify that the sea has very little to say. It's very blank. And even at this time, landscapes like this existed. I mean, these were all areas of mangroves, but already the map has kind of sanitized it, erased it. And so it's already presuming the direction it's going to go. But it's also building an entity out of Mumbai. And so we've often looked at sort of the progression. I mean, this is a typical sort of kind of drawing one would do of, how a city has grown. And I don't know when you look at an area like Stockholm with all your islands, how you think about it. But what's fascinating is that if anybody goes to Bombay today, they're told the story of the 7 islands, and that's how the city originated. If you look at even the old maps, there were hundreds of islands, and it was really dependent on which time of the day or season you were there. So this idea that the islands are circled by water, that land is definite and water is separate, was really constructed as a certain kind of mythology. And so we keep saying that how Bombay has fattened over time, that, it's got fatter and fatter. And it's probably got some of the most expensive real estates. I think it's close to Manhattan or even more expensive than Manhattan today. And so for us, this sense of island city, which is today its marketing, language, we sort of started to oppose to a very sort of different way of looking at it. And, from that, even Google Earth, that's the image people have of Mumbai. It's island city. It's even separate from the mainland, and if it could, it would just float away. But the moment we started to look at it in section, and it was again, for us, the section was an imaginative tool about how we can start to even use drawing as a way to open up another reality for ourselves. It's not so much to even to present to anybody. How do we as designers think differently? And so this is the same territory in a manner of speaking you're looking at. But here we have completely erased everything. Even if we have not physically erased the topography, we erased it in the way we look at it, in the way all the planning documents almost work with this being a flat terrain. But also what we've marginalized is the sea. Now it's very interesting that, when you look at the sea from land, you tend to see it across a line. And the sea, you tend to look in plan and you say land is here and the sea is here and it's a divide. But just think of how sailors actually thought about land when you were coming from the sea. I mean, when you're coming, you're just coming closer to land, and land actually tends to rise. And you start to get a sense that land is coming because the creatures have changed, or if it's a night, you're starting to navigate by stars. So when you think about the sea, you're really talking about time, and you're talking about section. And so for us to start bringing the sensibility of these two became really important. And so we started to think that, if we change the vocabulary of Mumbai as an island city and started to think about it as an estuary, where there is actually a relationship between land and sea, and that land and sea are both kind of working in negotiation with each other, it completely changed the way we looked at projects, the way we looked at what could be done. Even the Methi project that I showed you came out of that thinking about how can actually section and time open up a different kind of vocabulary. But it's not only in the physicality of those, images that I showed you of just the beach fronts and the sort of moving landscapes. It's even in practices. So there are maidans and maidans in Mumbai. I mean, there are formal maidans like this you see, which are still existing in a place like Mumbai, where, it's people play cricket, and at times there are 5 games of cricket going on simultaneously. But there are marketplaces which are like maidans. There are, places at the edge, which are actually would have been your typical beach, which actually are the maidans of the city today, where things come and go and practices actually expand and contract. And if you see what I'm doing is that I'm trying to actually get out of Maidan being just a spatial definition, that it's a large open space where anything can happen. It's also a way of thinking about territory. So even a street today is a Maidan if you allow it to actually be part, if it can infiltrate into the fabric and start to actually accommodate a whole bunch of things. And what's very interesting is that there are two, in one way what we've done is we've marginalized the sea. But we also marginalize the monsoon. So when you look at a drawing like this, while there's a clarity and the sea is right across a line, if you had the ability to look closer into the map, you'll see that there are little water bodies all over where, water is very precisely put in certain lakes, there's blue here and there's blue there. But when there's rain everywhere, how do you actually imagine this? And so we've been actually, looking at these as what we call fair weather maps, that we actually draw maps when the rain has passed and the weather is clear. Now just think of that particular, just think of the implication of that. That means that the monsoon is actually a visitor, that it's actually something outside, that today it's actually become a dangerous thing. So in a monsoon landscape, where does the monsoon become actually an outsider? And so without getting into detail, but I just want to give you a sense of then how did we start? We started to look at these 5 projects here. And these were actually 5 historical forts, which typically the ecological or archaeological department would take over and preserve as building. But if you had to really think about them as exclusive exclusive, you would do that. But if you had to be inclusive, we felt that you had to actually gather the landscapes. And each landscape is extremely diverse, culturally, materially, ecologically, from beachfronts, fishing village, to other fishing ports, to salt pans, mangroves, the flamingos which come here every year despite it being one of the most polluted, busy, populated areas. And how does one start to think of projects that don't actually erase these landscapes or start to work with them? And so what you're looking at are not now documentation drawings, they're actually propositions, and I won't describe them in detail, but in sections starting to work with gradients rather than lines, and also starting to work with these notations which actually give you a sense of time rather than actually space. And I'm just going to talk for a minute about that, is that for us as designers, we tend to control space, but if we had to start controlling practices and what actually starts to happen, and by that I don't mean programming, I'm really talking about practices, we might actually conceive of landscape in a very different way. And one example was that this particular fort really pollutes the beach because there are no toilets in that fort. And we had actually thought about these barges which are anchored over there, which actually start to process, the shit of Mumbai. But because this is a beach, you cannot build any public structures over there. They actually work in time. They go out into the sea, they come back. And so many of these things talk about how, certain fishing happens seasonally at a certain time. So some of these are existing practices, some are inventions that we are starting to introduce in. So how does one actually work with not the tabula rasa, but also starting to sort of, open it up to new sort of ideas? And again, a multiplicity of edges. So we're not talking about beach or recreation as kind of one thing over here. I'm going to just fly through this because I know I don't have much time. But this, Okay, I'm glad. I was thinking, I said, okay. No, but this is just the third territory. And these are sort of, we have done a lot of work in all these areas I'm talking about, but I'm just sort of drawing out a glimpse just to open up this idea of what we have excluded. And this is Bangalore, where I now live for one part of the year. And it's a city which is, loves naming itself, but one of, it's IT capital, everything, but here it loved to call itself City of Garden, Lakes, Empowerment and Champion. I don't know what that means, but anyway, they wanted to be all-inclusive. So that's the kind of statement you put up there. Now, this is a very interesting map from 1791, and this was a battle map between a chieftain, Tipu Sultan, and Lord Cornwallis, and this was a very decisive battle for Bangalore. But what's amazing about this map is that it actually tells you the nature of this terrain. And for battle, you did need to have a very clear sense of what high and low ground is. And so the sensibility of having high and low ground is particularly important for Bangalore. Now, I'm imagining that, I don't have a key map to show you where it is, but if most of you know, it's right in the middle of the peninsula. It's right in the middle, so we're not next to the sea, we're not next to any river. And so it's really a place where actually the rain falls and it starts the collection, really begins of surface runoff. So it's, many people say it's where rivers begin, actually. It's not at the... And so this particular system really works on the subtle high and low grounds. And what I want to draw your attention here is, it may not be clear there, but a line, which maybe my next image actually builds it up, yes. So this red line that we've drawn over that map is actually an embankment. It's called a band in Hindi. And what it is actually a human intervention. It's a design. So within a low swale, if you throw an embankment, you impound water. So this landscape is really made of these hundreds of impoundments. And what has already happened from that map to this map, which is in the 1800s, is that we've got bright blue. And though you subtly still see the embankments over here, they're slowly getting lost. So this is a British map, but already the idea that these are lakes. And if anybody understands the ecology of lakes, you expect a perennial water source, that lakes have water which is being replenished, from some source. But when you're talking about a surface collection, it's a very, very different thing. And so the whole ecology of this system was that it was a system of overflows. And when the rains came, it collected, and over time, you would have agriculture that would sort of follow as the water would recede. They would start to plant crops. And on the other side of the embankment, they would let out water strategically, have a different series of crops. So it was a very sort of elaborate system, but a very simple system. But the moment we think of it in the middle of Bangalore, we are starting to already imagine a city of lakes. And lakes tend to have a sense of isolation, exclusion, and then what you want is lakefront property, because you want the view or the reflection of your building in the water. And so this dilemma between lakes and bunds is a very, very serious one today. So, in some ways, this terrain of tanks never goes away. So today, Bangalore, which doesn't have as much rain as Mumbai, doesn't have a river, is flooding constantly every time the monsoon comes, and you wonder why. Because it's a complete lack of understanding of what this landscape is about. But also what's really important is that on one side, the lakes are leading us to this kind of landscape. And, look at this. This could be Switzerland. It could be something you're more familiar with. And that's what the image is, that preserve lakes, plant trees, keep Bangalore clean and green. And so we get this kind of very artificial, planting. Or because they're isolated, they are also being filled up. They are being encroached on. Housing developments are coming on it, and they are completely being, taken away. But there are also ecologists who are talking about them as wetlands, are wanting to preserve them for the birds and the bees and everything else. And we even have a problem with them because these are not wetlands. They were meant to dry up. They are becoming cesspools. You have to call the army every 5 years to dredge them out because they're not being naturally dredged. And even, my partner Dilip, who grew up in Bangalore, remembers, all his cricket happened in the tank beds when they were dry. And there are times when they look like this, and there are times like they are like that. But the whole flower market, which is a very important industry in the south, would actually follow the receding and moving of water. The brick industry used to be on the edge of the tank beds because they were the natural, actually, you would be able to remove the layer of clay. So it was ready for the next season. And so by misunderstanding that, we actually created a disaster, which never was actually in this landscape. And, there was one event, and I'll just sort of quickly describe you that, so one image which people hold today still is this, and we have government officials asking us, no, but that particular one is a lake, isn't it a natural lake? And we say there's nothing like a natural lake in the whole terrain of Bangalore. But there was an event, which I think the Ganesh, which is the elephant god, and where it's made out of clay, and it used to be made out of clay which was taken from these tank beds. And it would be a whole event of a month in which this Ganesh was then taken into the market, it was taken into homes, it was, there were prayers and ceremonies around it. But then the monsoon would come and these tank beds would fill up. And they would take the Ganesh and put it back into the tank. And so we felt that this event actually, and so these drawings, what we call tank to tank, opened up, again, a very sectional landscape. And when they put the Ganesh back, they didn't throw it into the lake, they actually submerged it slowly. So it went sectionally in. And so to understand this high and low ground for us was a complete sort of, it was so essential that we felt that by drawing that line today, which was, around that sort of that border, has completely taken us in a different direction. And so it's taken us, and there are many implications to it, from the way we look at history and monuments, the way we look at the idea of garden city as something which is enclosed and separate from its enclosure, to start building a sense of continuity and openness. And this is, if you zoom out a little bit and look at the terrain beyond, this would be when it is all full of water. And what you're looking at here is actually the human agency, is just the bunds, the little lines of the embankments that were man-made. So it opens up a very ingenious system which is actually works additively. And, so you can go from tank to tank to tank, and it's politically also a very interesting system that doesn't work on hierarchy. It works, I can go on any line. If I miss the water from here, the water can come down from another line. It would take me a little while to explain this drawing, but it dismantles this particular one and shows that how this particular reservoir is not the last one, but has many, many, many alternate possibilities. And so what's happening today is that now this was a systemic idea, so what you're looking at is a low ground. So by isolating the tanks or these particular lakes, we've made the area connecting them into sewage drains actually. So these lines, which have to exist still today because that's what the terrain is about, have all become sewers today. And so there's been a separation of water bodies and lines which are sewers. And we feel that that's the reality we have to deal with. I mean, so we are not talking about going back to this because within the fabric of Bangalore, you cannot really recover it. But you can start to intelligently again think of low and high grounds. And sometimes you can think of it in very small ways. So we've been sort of often saying that, you don't have to preserve that lake where it was. Where there is an opportunity, you can have other embankments. You can impound water in other places. Or if as the city is expanding, we're not even bringing the sensibility to what we are looking around us. Now, why? And I started with the Maidan. To me, in that sense, the low ground is the Maidan, which allowed for this kind of fluctuation. And at times you can do it at this level of the whole region, the whole city, but you can also think about it in very small areas. So we were recently actually, asked to sort of work pro bono for a community in Bangalore, which is working on just what would be 3 series of parks, which would be the size of this room put 3 times. And how can you take the same idea and actually start to work it in multiple ways? And so this sensibility that it's really about human agency, we're not talking about this as natural or nature, but how do we start to read the terrain and work with that? And so I'm just looking at a tank which used to be there, which is that orange, that's our coloring on top of the map, which today is, this terrain doesn't exist. It's a development like many places which I'm sure you've seen here. And so you think that it is completely erased. But there is actually a park, and probably it was a park because it was actually always wet, and they didn't know why it was wet, but it was wet. And, just in terms of progression, so what remains today is a drain that goes right through it, and it's meant to be a stormwater drainage, but it actually quite isn't. It really carries sewage and everything else. Okay, that's perfect, yeah. So for us, actually, it was really important that, this is, as I said, it's a very small territory. This is an old people's park. This is a children's park. This is a playing ground. Can we start to actually open this landscape up rather than make it more enclosed and start to think that the working of the tank system, which actually starts to make a gradient between the low and the high ground, become the starting point of this becoming a much more open landscape? So topographically, most of you, know how to read drawings, so you can understand what we are trying to do there. And one could say that, we are just daylighting, the old buried stream. But in terms of, it is much more than that because, from actually starting to plant the low grounds, it also starts to work with the fluctuation of uses because today people play cricket here, but when, these areas which are completely flat, if you just tip them slightly in the time of the monsoon, they could actually become larger holdings of water. So it's not only that water is held in what looks deeper, they all become working landscapes. And in some ways, when the water recedes, you can actually, the urban functions, it doesn't have to be agriculture today, can start to actually reoccupy this territory. And so the sensibility, whether at what scale we are working at, it doesn't matter. And I think that's the wonderful sense of the work we do as landscape architects, that, we can work with an idea that can work systemically at many, many different levels. So, from a room this small, a small little garden, and we saw some wonderful projects this morning that Cornelia showed, and you were already doing things with sewage and grey water, with holding rain. But it's a very different sensibility to think that this is a monsoon surface, that water is actually everywhere before it's somewhere. And when we put water somewhere, we separate it. We construct a kind of exclusion that has ramifications that are actually causing disasters today that we are having to bring risk management people in to start solving for us. And so, in many ways, this vocabulary, which seems very innocent to us, we're all working on riverfront projects, seafront, lakefronts. But if you start to actually sort of challenge it a little bit and think that if I just look at the Sabarmati, I don't even want to call it the Sabarmati riverbed because then I feel that it is a river and I'm allowing somebody to occupy it and, when it's not the monsoon. But if you look at a plain where goats go, people People, immigrants have come and gone in those areas, and it is always under settlement. It's not something which we have enclosed and given to the city, but actually the city has occupied certain parts of it. So the Maidan is a spirit that actually exists underneath that. If I look at the seafront in Bombay, to think that the estuary is always there, even beneath the 20 million people who live there, there is an estuary. And how in every project, whether I'm looking at a little fort or I'm doing a large infrastructural project, can I start thinking of holdings rather than water being draining the land and just flowing off it, which is what the sensibility is, that we have to make barriers against the sea, we have to make barriers against rivers. And there are many other projects we've been working on recently also in Virginia. We have friends from Virginia, in Norfolk, Virginia, where we find that it's not only about the monsoon landscape in India, it's actually landscapes across the world where we are actually underestimating rain. And that with the sea level rise conversation, actually rain is missing in that conversation. And most places are going under because of backed up rain. I just want to, I was going to end with these two slides, but because I have a few more minutes, I'm going to just do another little thing. But what's really important, what I wanted to leave you guys with, was this idea that we really believe, and it's sort of been going through all our work, and I'd never quite thought of it till I had to put this particular presentation together for this, event, that when we exclude water, we exclude people. And I think, what our moderator talked about this morning when we started about that, there's a whole other challenge in Europe, that people are not don't have entitlements to places, that, people are everywhere. And by everywhere, I don't mean, we are crowding everywhere, but that you cannot stop water and you cannot stop people. And how do you actually understand that? And then we would be able to negotiate landscapes very, very differently. And it's amazing how this paradigm is, maybe you guys here are even questioning it already. It is very much part of the development agenda. So cities like Bombay, cities in Asia, and the 300 new cities that my Prime Minister in India is going to sort of develop, that's the paradigm they're working on right now. And how do we actually start to shift that around is a very serious question. I just added a postscript thinking that if I keep good time, I'm going to actually show you a little bit. And by that, I just want to give you a very quick glimpse of my practice with Dilip da Cunha, who is not here today because my partner, we work very much together. And the way we've actually been working is that a lot of our work, we work through public exhibitions, what we call civic exhibitions, which include the voice of people. They are our exhibitions, but they've been at public venues where people can come through. And we find that changing how people imagine, that's a very important mode of practice for us. That we actually put these things out, put these new imaginings out into the public. We probably know we do work through writing and books. Some of these books came out of the exhibitions, some followed the exhibitions, some were dissociated from them. There's, I think, another book which is called Design in the Terrain of Water, which I don't have an image of here, which just came out of a symposium, which is actually challenging very much a lot of what I've sort of talked about today. But we were able to gather a vast range of voices from across the world who we pushed to not think about their projects in the way they normally did, but from this point of view. We've done in the past a lot of ideas competitions, as many of you are doing. We build projects selectively when we get the chance and we think that projects are challenging for us. Now, this is a house in Bangalore, a botanical garden, which is an ongoing project, and it keeps evolving every year as our client keeps buying more acres of land. And it's actually a very open project which has the capacity to do that. We've been working on speculative projects, which are real projects, but they've not been built yet. In the middle is just an image of the Norfolk project, but it's, there's a lot more to it than those few images. But a lot of what we do is teach also. So pedagogically teaching from the foundation to teaching senior level studios, we really try and inculcate a lot of what we are thinking through actually our teaching. But also through material practices that, we are very interested in through printmaking and other ways of working materially that starts to actually push analogically the same things we are talking about through ideas, through a research into history, as to how do materially you actually even start to work with improvisation, work with inclusion, work with a different sense of boundaries. And so I just wanted to leave you with this in terms of our own practice about, rather than saying we're architects, landscape architects, planning, I thought it's better to talk about ideas, design activism, material practices, writing, and pedagogy. Thank you. Mm-hmm.